Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon. We have another fine, fantastic, wonderful guest on the line. We have the great David Montgomery from the Siècle podcast. Hello, David.
Hello, John. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, our first time. For those of you who don't know the Siècle, I highly recommend it. It's definitely one of the best podcasts out there. For the uninitiated, David, could you give a brief overview on the Siècle and the Siècle.com?
Yeah, so the siècle means century in French, and my goal, we'll see if I live long enough to do it, is to cover the century in French history after Napoleon, sort of starting in 1814 and going through the round 100 years up to 1914, the start of World War I, which is sort of this often overlooked period of French history. People know there's some revolutions and some impressionists in there, and that's, I think, about as much as most people know. I'm going through mostly in order, research scripted episodes, and doing my best to shed some light on little-known periods like the Bourbon Restoration, the July Monarchy, and events yet to come. And of course, Napoleon, the whole Napoleonic era is casting a massive shadow over this period. As we'll get into today, lots of the same figures are active in the post-Napoleonic period. And just the memory of Napoleon and the Empire continues to impact all these decisions that everyone is making, even the people who were not around in France during Napoleon's reign.
Yeah, it's kind of like aftershocks to an earthquake. You know, it just continues to go on and on. Eventually, you'll get to Napoleon III, I would imagine. So, yeah, very interesting. If you'd like to check out, again, the Siècle podcast, you can find it anywhere podcasts are heard. I also recommend you check out the Patreon for them and the YouTube page for the Siècle. All very good resources. And who are we going to talk about today? It's one of my favorite episodes of yours.
Yeah, this is the episode I just put out as of September 8th, 2024, so just a couple weeks before we're recording this, looking at the life and career of Auguste Marmont, the Duke of Ragusa, Marshal Marmont, covering his career under Napoleon, but also focusing really on sort of the final big act of Marmont's life, which was commanding the defense of Paris during the July Revolution in 1830. And I won't spoil where this conversation is going to go, but like a lot of things in Marmont's life, that doesn't go as well as he hoped.
No, it does not. The much maligned Marshal Marmont, and we'll get on to why he's maligned here in just a bit. But we're going to give our audience, I mean, most of my audience knows who Marmont is, but we'll give a quick background on the infamous Marshal. He was born a minor noble and becomes friends with Napoleon as both were kind of rising through the ranks as artillerymen. Marmont has some natural talent, but he's also promoted rapidly through the ranks. Is that based on his skill or his friendship with the rising star that is Napoleon?
Both. Probably more. I mean, a lot of people got promoted fairly rapidly in this period of the Revolutionary Wars. There was a lot of the Ancien Regime nobles had emigrated, so there was a lot of room for promotion. And Marmont definitely distinguished himself as a young man. He was very smart, physically brave, and if you're intelligent and willing to charge into the thick of things and you survive, you're probably going to get promoted. But it doesn't hurt if you're best buds with Napoleon Bonaparte, who is rising even more quickly in this period, and wants to keep people around him who he trusts and likes.
Right. And he for a time lived with Marmont and General Junot, so they were really close buddies at one point. And you mentioned quite rightly in your episode on Marmont that one of his best skills was that as an administrator or governor of conquered territories. And I'd like to point this out, that just because you're a good general doesn't mean you're a good administrator. Marshal Massena, Marshal Victor were terrible administrators. They just looted everything. So there's a big difference here. Why was Marmont, you think, talented when he governed Dalmatia?
Yeah, he governed Dalmatia, which is an area in what's now mostly Croatia today. He was also the governor of conquered Alexandria during the Egyptian operation. And for whatever reason, the administrative drive meshed well with Marmont's somewhat finicky, detail-oriented approach, but he also had people around him that he could rely on to help keep him focused and it didn't require the same level of split-second decision-making that you might see in an actual battle. Marmont was a very intelligent general. He wrote books on military theory, really excelled at the more intellectual side of war, and for whatever reason, when he was given a chance to sort of step back and engage in the military life, but without the sort of the split-second decision-making, he did very well. I quote the Austrian emperor, who, after taking control of Dalmatia for Austria, looked at the various roads and reforms that had been made and said, "It's a great pity that Marshal Marmont was not 2 or 3 years longer in Dalmatia."
Yeah, it sounds like he was making some real inroads and really bringing that country up to speed. And eventually, Napoleon does make General Marmont into a marshal in 1809 after the Battle of Wagram. But later notes as he's handing him the baton that he's not sure he's done enough to earn it, which is it's kind of like a backhanded slight. And Marmont is one who took notice of all the slights, correct?
It's certainly not unique among Napoleon's marshals in doing that, but Marmont was not part of the original group of marshals, despite having been close friends with Napoleon, having in his mind distinguished himself on a number of occasions. He certainly felt that he should have been promoted and took that grudge. Then he finally got made marshal, and as you note, Napoleon sort of gave it to him with sort of a backhanded slap. And this whole time, this once close friendship was pulling apart, and I don't think you can blame either man entirely for it. I mean, Napoleon was in the stratosphere at this time, and it's hard for men like that to maintain close friendships.
Yeah.
Marmont was often away, but they were also clashing more when they were in contact. This was not a case of people, kept apart by circumstance, but who bond when they get back together. Increasingly, when the two were together now, there were sparks flying.
Yeah.
Not in the good way.
Yeah, eventually Marmont is back into Spain, where he fails miserably against the brilliant Duke of Wellington. Can you briefly sum up the Battle of Salamanca? I know he comes in and takes over from Marshal Massena, who has failed in Napoleon's eyes. What happens there?
Yeah, so he takes over control of the French forces, and at first he does pretty well. Wellington is trying to bait the French into a battle on ground of his choosing, and Marmont is a very cautious and calculating general and refuses to be drawn into this trap. But ultimately he does sort of arrange, he's there to fight, so ultimately he maneuvers down Wellington. The battle is engaged, but here he makes at least one crucial mistake, or if not two. You probably know more about the nitty-gritty of this battle than I do and can sort of fill in the viewers more. But he lets himself be misled by bad intelligence. He doesn't see through the bad scouting reports that are coming in, and so forms a mistaken impression of what Wellington's doing.
Yep.
So that's sort of the big mistake. And then he follows that by a failure of micromanagement. And when one of his divisions starts to drift out of alignment, he doesn't catch it, which opens a gap that the British charge through,
Yep.
or the Anglo-Portuguese force, to not slight the many non-British people who are fighting. And then he gets badly wounded by a artillery shell and is carted off the field. If he had stayed, maybe he would have been able to do better than his other generals at salvaging that battle. It's counterfactual history, who knows? But it doesn't go well without Marmont, and it probably wouldn't have gone well if he'd still been on the field.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the mistake was made. He let his lead division get separated from the other divisions. And a lot of battlefield commanders, you have to make decisions with imperfect information. As you astutely point out, he made a poor decision, and he compounded it by letting the divisions drift apart, and then he got injured, which isn't necessarily his fault, but he probably should have been out of range, but he was trying to fix his one mistake, and then I think he lost an arm eventually to that wound.
Certainly took him a long time to recover. Time he was recovering in Paris, which was important because it meant that as he was recovering in 1812, most of his fellow military officers were off dying in Russia at the time, or dying in Spain at the time. So he made a lot of new friends, bourgeois types, civilians back in Paris. Intellectuals, saloniers, academicians, which would prove very important a few years later.
Yeah, we'll definitely come to that. And I think it's very interesting also, Napoleon hears about Salamanca on the eve of Borodino, which is obviously the bloodiest battle in the Napoleonic Wars, and he says to General Caulaincourt, quote, "Marmont talks very cleverly about war, but turns out to be worse than mediocrity when it comes to action," end quote. So I think he likes his friend, like you said. He had all the qualifications to be a marshal. He was friends with Napoleon. He'd been in the Italian and Egyptian campaigns. He studied war, but it seems like when he had independent battlefield command, he didn't do too well. Now, he later fights well in the 1813 German campaign and not so well in the 1814 invasion of France, where he's correctly described as one of the, quote, droopy-plumed marshals who no longer believe Napoleon can win. You touched on it earlier where he's starting to talk to influential businessmen and politicians like Talleyrand, perhaps. How do we get to the point where Marmont surrenders Paris without Napoleon's permission?
I mean, this is certainly, well, at least before one of the two lowlights of Marmont's life in terms of his reputation. Arguably not, certainly not his lowest point as a military commander, but it's spring of 1814. Napoleon has been winning battles, but losing the war as France is being invaded. He gets sort of deked away from Paris, and Napoleon is racing with the main French field army back toward Paris, and is hoping for one final climactic battle where he can smash Alexander and the Allies. And to do this, Napoleon needs the defenders of Paris to hold out. And they're in a terrible situation. Paris is not fortified at this time. The French forces there are outnumbered. Marmont and several other officers, Mortiers there, are sort of in military command. And Joseph is in sort of civil command as the regent in Paris. And Marmont and the other marshals fight well in the initial battles. Marmont fights at the front. He's wounded. Certainly, whatever you can say about Marmont, he has real physical courage. He never hesitated to throw himself into the thick of the fighting, and often suffered as a consequence from it. He's, and he does it's arguably a French tactical victory, at least in terms of, they held the Allies back from the city. They didn't get routed off the field. But, right. Marmont's heart is no longer in it. And neither is anyone else's in Paris, really. I mean, Joseph's role in this often gets skipped over. That Joseph abandons the city and specifically authorizes the marshals to enter into talks with the Allies.
Yeah, and Marshal Murat has already turned earlier in January against Napoleon. So Marmont's not the first to make this move.
Yeah, Joseph has abandoned the city, fled with the money and his property and all that. Marmont is authorized to make a deal, and he does. He meets with the Allies, strikes a deal to prevent Paris from getting sacked, which was a threat that was out there. He preserves his army. There's also trying to sort of improve the surrendering position for Napoleon, trying to get him not rounded up and shot by the conquering Allies, which certainly the Prussians would have been happy to do. But, this is not simply a question of Marmont just striking the best deal. He genuinely thought at this time that, Napoleon should lose at this time. That Napoleon was not the leadership France needed. He thought that the restored Bourbon monarchy, with a constitution to limit their abuses so they couldn't go back to the ancien regime, he thought that was going to be genuinely the best course for France. And he was certainly not alone in thinking that. That was very common in political opinion at the time in France, as well as in the Allied armies. So he strikes this deal, and Napoleon ends up being just half a day's march away when he gets the word. And Napoleon certainly always felt that he could have salvaged the war if Marmont had held out. Most historians I've read don't think that's actually true, but it is certainly true that Marmont weakened Napoleon's leverage considerably, as he was trying to negotiate for the best deal, the best exit that he could.
Correct. And I bet if you asked Marmont, he would tell you that, yes, I did this, but I was doing it for the good of Paris and the country. I wasn't just feathering my own bed.
Yeah, I mean, it preserved Marmont's career. He was kept on by the restored Bourbons. As a marshal, he was given command of part of the king's bodyguard, healthy salary. He was not, many French military men, were drummed out of the army after the Bourbon Restoration. Right. In part because, they were at peace now and they couldn't maintain a massive Napoleonic army.
Right.
Marmont did preserve his career, but he always insisted, with a certain degree of self-pity, but not entirely wrong, that he had sacrificed himself and his reputation to save France, because this was roundly unpopular, especially once a little time had passed and people weren't worried about getting sacked anymore.
It's funny because the reputation's already in tatters, and he somehow makes it even worse as time goes on. But we'll get to that.
Yeah, he becomes the real scapegoat, and he was the senior marshal in command at the moment, and the one who struck the deal. But then you also have the personal aspect of it, that Napoleon felt personally betrayed by Marmont because of their history of friendship, and we all know that hell hath no fury like a lover spurned. And even though there wasn't really any friendship left by this point, I really think that personal aspect made it feel so much worse for Napoleon.
Yeah, and I try and look at from both perspectives. Like Napoleon's thinking, I've done so much for this man, how could he do this? And then Marmont's probably thinking, well, I've done a lot for France and the Empire. How could you let us come to this point and not make peace with the Allies? I'm just taking the next logical step. So I see both. So I'm fine with Marmont now. The rest, I'm not at all. We'll get to that. So Napoleon's exiled for the final time in 1815 to St. Helena after Waterloo. What is Marmont's life post-Napoleon? You mentioned he stays on. He's kept the marshal by the Bourbons. Makes friends with a lot of rich merchants and businessmen. Something I cannot allow or agree with is that he voted for the death of Marshal Ney, which disgusted many in France. So what's he doing post-1815?
Yeah, so he sticks around. He stays loyal to the Bourbons during the 100 Days. He does not go over to Napoleon at Waterloo, which works out well for him in the long run. He's part of the whole messy trial of Marshal Ney. I think there's only one member of the Chamber of Peers who didn't vote to execute Ney. Marmont was certainly not alone in that. There's also a lot of hopes that there's a feeling that Ney had to be found guilty, but there was the hope that the king might pardon him. Certainly Ney had ample opportunities to escape France, and
he did.
For reasons that are still a little mysterious today, didn't really take them up and dithered his way until he got captured, much to the disappointment of Louis XVIII, who would have greatly preferred to avoid creating a martyr and to have Ney slip away. But certainly Marmont did not cover himself in glory by voting as a member of the Chamber of Peers for the execution of his one-time comrade. It is one of those things like where you can say, oh, the political moment was one of retribution, and there's a feeling that the Bourbons had been too lenient, they hadn't purged people in 1814, and that had contributed to the rapid collapse in the 100 Days. Blood was in the air. A lot of people looked back on this years later and thought, oh, well, we shouldn't have killed Ney, we should have done something different. But Marmont was in a position to know better than, say, the Duchesse d'Angoulême, the king's niece, who later read accounts of Ney's actions in the retreat from Moscow and was said to have regretted not asking for a pardon at the time. Marmont knew. This is not a moment of courage for Marmont to vote for executing his comrade.
No. And you mentioned one in the Chamber of Peers voted to pardon him and let him go. I know Marshal Marmont notably went to jail because he didn't want to be involved. And Davout even said not even Ragusa could vote for death, and mentioning Marmont.
Yeah.
And sure enough, he did. He also notably gets divorced in 1817 from his wife Anne-Marie. They had no children. So he's starting to slide a little bit. He has money, but that goes away too, which I think is the most fascinating thing about Marmont post-1815. What is the deal with the sheep business?
Yeah, so Marmont is rich, as all the marshals were, but he's not rich. He did not loot as thoroughly as certain other marshals did not take advantage of his position as much as some did. But he was independently wealthy, and being the kind of guy who's an intellectual, hangs around with members of the French Academy, got himself made a member of the French Academy in this time, generally sees himself as an intelligent, capable person. Like a lot of intelligent, capable, or self-seen intelligent, capable aristocrats at this time, he fancies himself an improver. He wants to innovate on his farm, to find new innovations that can improve the efficiency of agriculture. And Marmont's a bit of a dilettante in this. He was sort of notorious for starting schemes, then abandoning them. But by far the most notorious, and it's possible this has been blown a little bit out of proportion by some of the chroniclers, was the sheep business. That Marmont had an estate in eastern France, and he sort of concluded, not unreasonably, that sheep was the most profitable way to use his land, because sheep were in value for their wool. They could also provide meat. They could provide fertilizer. Fertilizer was helpful for intensifying agriculture. France had a textile industry that was getting going. It wasn't a dumb decision there. Sheep are not cheap. Marmont spent a lot of money buying up fine merino sheep, as well as other sheep, Because he was not super rich, he went into some debt to do this. And then there comes the jackets.
Right. This is where it takes a right turn.
Never figured out where he got the idea. But Marmont at one point gets the idea that, his sheep keep dying from disease. He gets the idea that if the sheep have coats, little overcoats around them, that will protect them from parasites and infection and lead to them both not dying as much and then producing better quality wool. So he goes all in for this. He builds a fancy new barn, and he buys thousands of sheep coats for his sheep, made of sheepskin, by the way, which is a little macabre. Sews his sheep into these overcoats, and it does produce slightly better wool. The sources say that it does sell for a little bit more than it was selling, but the mortality rate doesn't improve. The jackets cost more than he was anticipating. They produce less of a payoff than he was hoping for. And the net result of all of this was Marmont was deeply in debt. He actually had to go to King Charles X and beg for a bailout. Charles agreed to say, we'll continue paying your salary even if you die, so that your creditors can count on getting this money.
Right.
And the net result is that his entire salary as a French general is now pledged to his creditors, which means that he can't quit. He's trapped in this job, whether he wanted to or not. And I guess in a second we'll get to moments when Marmont might have quit.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to just because you're a good general or a good administrator doesn't mean you're a good businessman. Same thing with Napoleon. He was a great general. He was a good administrator, but some would say he wasn't a very good diplomat. It doesn't mean you're good at everything.
Yeah. And had Marmont been richer, this could have been, this is an unfortunate business. I lost some money on those sheep. But right. He wasn't rich enough to afford losses and mistakes like this.
Right. And unlike, say, an Augereau or Massena or Marshal Soult, who looted everything they were near and had plenty of money to fall back on, Marmont's now locked into, like you said, his creditors, and he can't just quit and live in his country estate and count his money. He's locked into working forever, correct?
Yeah, which matters in 1830, when King Charles X and his prime minister and foreign minister, Jules de Polignac, are plotting an invasion of Algiers in Africa, the north coast of Africa. And, there's a very long, complicated history about why France is doing this, related to diplomacy and to the political needs of Jules de Polignac. But to make a long story short, France has been essentially at peace since Napoleon, with a minor adventure in Spain and an expedition to Greece notwithstanding. Which means there's not a lot of opportunities for advancement and glory for military men like Marmont. And when word starts spreading that France is plotting this invasion, Marmont very desperately wants to be put in command of the invasion of Algiers. And he doesn't get it.
He doesn't get it. And we get to the 1830 revolution, which permanently ends the Bourbon regime in France. The Bourbons are already...
spoilers for my show.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Fine, no, we're almost there.
Yeah.
It is on Wikipedia. There's no actual spoilers in history.
That's true. The Bourbons were already unpopular for a number of reasons. But what was the revolution about, and what were the details of the, notorious four ordinances that really kind of was the kindling that set off the fire?
Yeah, so the Bourbon Restoration was the first restored king was Louis XVIII, who was the younger brother of the guillotined Louis XVI. And Louis XVIII was conservative, but somewhat moderate. One could debate how exactly it should be classified, but Louis appears to have been genuinely committed to the idea of constitutional monarchy. He, at various occasions, appointed liberal ministers to lead his government. The youngest of the three brothers of Louis XVI and Louis XVIII was Charles X, who was at this time known as the Comte d'Artois. And Artois was always known as an arch-reactionary. He sort of led the far-right opposition from inside the royal palace during Louis XVIII's reign. And Charles is a bit more personable than Louis. He gets on better with people one-on-one. So when Charles finally becomes king in 1824, he has a bit of a honeymoon phase. He ends censorship. People cheer him. But gradually, as his government starts passing policies and taking symbolic actions that always tack to the right, toward more of a role for the Catholic Church and religion in French state, more power for the king and for the aristocracy. There's the sort of so-called émigrés billion, where the French taxpayers bail out former émigrés who were sent into exile during the French Revolution. They're compensated to a certain degree for their territory that was seized, which, ironically, most historians conclude this is actually pretty good policy because there's this festering political wound where the émigrés were agitating to get their land back, and by paying them off, which the French state could afford, it sort of ended this agitation and made the people who'd bought this seized land more comfortable in their ownership. But the optics were terrible. The French taxpayers were bailing out a bunch of aristocrats who'd fled the country. It was dubbed the émigrés billion. It was very unpopular. There was a law passed with the death penalty for sacrilege, for profaning the communion host, which is never implemented. So again, like a maximum political damage without an actual impact. And these things are sort of piled up. Charles at one point is sort of forced to appoint a more moderate ministry, but hates it. Hates the idea that he's having to compromise, that he's having to make concessions to these liberals who he views as being destructive to France. And so in 1829, he finally says, enough with that. I'm going to appoint the guy I want all along, appoints Jules de Polignac, who's his fellow arch-reactionary, longtime conspirator, far-right figure in French politics. And at that moment, France is in just a permanent political crisis.
Yeah.
People are expecting Polignac to launch a coup at any moment to purge the opposition and entrench royal power. Polignac doesn't for a long time, and people have debated whether that was a blunder. But eventually, there's another round of French elections. The victory in Algiers by the Marmontless French army fails to produce any popularity for Charles's regime. The liberals win again, but rather than accept this loss and a new sort of opposition-controlled Chamber of Deputies, Charles signs the Four Ordinances on July 25th, 1830, which do a couple of things, but the big thing they do is they impose sweeping censorship on France, and they dissolve the newly elected Chamber of Deputies before it could even take office, and they unilaterally rewrite the French electoral laws to disqualify a lot of liberal voters and provide even more weight to the highest aristocrats. I mean, this is already a system where you can't vote unless you're rich. Basically, the richest 1% or so of French men have the right to vote. And the Four Ordinances shift even more weight to the 0.25%, the richest 1/4 of this richest 1%. And, it's an effort to purge the liberals, to reestablish his regime, and it almost immediately provokes a fierce reaction. There are protests in the streets that Polignac and the French police failed to contain, in part because Polignac was so focused on keeping this secret to avoid spilling the beans that he failed to take any precautions, like bringing in extra soldiers or reinforcements to Paris. And as the street protests turn into riots, and then riots turn into actual street fighting, and about this time, Marmont, who's been tisk-tisking about the Four Ordinances, just as a private citizen, is told, actually, you're in command. Go deal with this.
Right. And it's not going to go well. In fact, it's going to be the end of the Bourbon. Charles X is going to be the last king of France, and he's actually going to die outside the country, which is...
Although not the last king of the French.
Correct. Yeah. So before we get to all that and how they're exiled, you said Marmont is placed in charge. How did he go about putting down this result, and how did it work out?
So he's very belatedly told he's in charge, several days after he was actually appointed to the job of commanding the French military, the military district around Paris. The French police, the military police, the gendarmes had been trying and failing. The royal guard had been out. Marmont does respond briskly. He sort of brings order to the whole situation, a centralized command. He deploys the troops of the line to help sort of stabilize the situation. But, Marmont has far too few soldiers. There's only like 10,000 French soldiers in Paris at this time because Polignac has refused to call in for reinforcements.
And I found that fascinating in your recent episode. Like 10,000 in your mind is a lot, but for a city the size of Paris, it really isn't.
Yeah, there's hundreds of thousands of people, close to 1 million people in Paris at this time. and while certainly not all of them, or even most of them, aren't revolting at this time, you don't need a very large percentage of 1 million people to severely outnumber 10,000. In an open field, Marmont's 10,000 regulars might have just steamrolled 30,000 Parisians. But they weren't in an open field. It was urban warfare, which then and now is a great equalizer.
And it's not 1795 where there's cannons set up by Napoleon to mow everyone down with a whiff of grape shot, right? These soldiers are unmotivated. I think they were at post for a long time without food or water, right? They were just standing there.
Yeah, Marmont fails to secure his supply lines. Again, he was put into a terrible situation. I don't know if even Napoleon could have won this battle, and Napoleon certainly would have done better than Marmont did. This 1830 is the first real introduction of barricades into French history. Those did not play a major role in the 1789 French Revolution. There's not really street barricades there. But there are in 1830. Central Paris at this time is this weaving warren of old, narrow medieval streets, which are very easy to block. And suddenly, you can't get messages and detachments through Central Paris. The French army has a military bakery in Paris that is baking thousands upon thousands of loaves of bread to feed the French army, and the bread just sits there because they can't get it through to where the soldiers are, a mile away, and so the soldiers go hungry, which isn't good for their morale.
Right, and you mentioned in your podcast as well, I thought it was interesting, Marmont wasn't the preferred choice, but the main preferred guy was off in Algiers, correct?
Yeah, so I'm one of the unpopular figures in the Polignac government. It was not just Polignac who was unpopular. One of the unpopular figures was Marshal Marmont, a different fellow from Marmont. Marmont had been a French general who had ostensibly rallied to Napoleon during the 100 Days and defected to the Allies on the eve of Waterloo. So he was notorious. Marmont's name, the Duke of Ragusa, was turned into a verb ragusard, meaning a traitor or to betray. Verb and noun forms there. But Marmont was actively defected. It was much more clear cut there. Arguably, that may have been his intention all along. He's always of royalist sympathies. Certain of Napoleon's aides said, "What are you talking about? Don't hire this guy."
Yeah. Even Blucher had no time for this guy. He's like, I don't want to deal with a traitor. Tell him to go away. Yeah.
But Marmont was a competent general of undeniable ultra-royalist politics. Unlike Marmont, who was sort of sympathetic to the liberal opposition, Marmont was reliable. Unfortunately, Marmont was the guy who got command of the Algiers invasion, in part because of his reliable politics. So he was off in Africa with tens of thousands of the best, highest quality troops in the French army, which, by the way, left Polignac acting as acting minister of war, despite having no military experience. So one has to figure that had Marmont been around, at the very least, the military logistics would have been handled better. But, with Marmont gone, Marmont's the most senior guy left, so he gets tapped to be in command.
Yeah, and he soon realizes, this isn't some simple street protest or a strike, and he has to go tell the king, hey, look, we're not going to win this thing, right?
Yeah, he sends a very sharp letter after the July Revolution of 1830 is dubbed the Three Glorious Days. There's 3 days of street fighting. And the first day, and each one escalates. And sort of the story of the July Revolution, from the perspective of the government's side, is too little too late. Every step, both military escalation and political pacification that they take, always is the sort of thing that would have been successful had they done it the day before. By the time they actually get around to doing it, it's too late. So the first day is sort of when the riots turn into street fighting. When people start building barricades, smashing street lights, and it's hard fighting. Marmont has sort of deployed his forces mostly the western part of central Paris, and has then been sending out detachments to try to clear streets. And these detachments are always just not quite big enough to force their way through these barricades that are going up. But eventually, after hard fighting, it's late at night, midnight, and the French people go home to bed. And Marmont has the moment to think, we've won. It was a riot, we deployed the soldiers, we killed some people, things will be quiet tomorrow. On the ground, this is very clearly not what's the case. It's a very tense, ominous night. All the lights in Paris are out. It's just utter silence and tension growing. And in the morning, the people come back out into the streets, start building more barricades.
Yeah.
And Marmont, very quickly, to his credit, he's already back at his headquarters. He's on the ground. He's getting these reports. This is not a case of someone who slept through the revolution or something like that. He very quickly realizes he was wrong and sends this very striking dispatch to the king, which I'll just read out here. I have already had the honor of reporting to your majesty the dispersal of the groups that disturbed the peace of Paris. This morning they are forming again, more numerous and more threatening than before. This is no longer a riot, this is a revolution. It is urgent that your majesty decide on the means of pacification. The honor of his crowd can still be saved. Tomorrow, perhaps, it will be too late. For today, I am taking the same measures as I did yesterday. The troops will be ready at noon, but I await with impatience the orders of your majesty.
So, yeah, it's like judgment hour. Like, do we stay and try and put down and kill everybody, or do we just pack up and leave and never return to France? And
the implication is, Marmont clearly believes at this point that he cannot win this militarily. When he says, it is urgent that your majesty decide on the means of pacification, Marmont means you got to make political concessions. You got to fire Polignac or repeal the 4 ordinances or do something.
Yeah, and for an ultra-royalist like Charles X, that's probably hard medicine for him to swallow. Like, I don't want to listen to this rabble.
Yeah, no, it's a big move. It would mean, deeply embarrassing, no matter your politics, to have to immediately go back on something you just did a few days ago, something that you had talked yourself into believing was the only way to save your regime.
Yeah.
To make a concession to the rebels. Charles had lived through as a young man the French Revolution in 1789, and as an ultra-royalist, he thought that the reason the French Revolution happened was because Louis XVI was too vacillating, that he made too many concessions. Mm-hmm. And so he was not going to be quick to make concessions to resolve another street revolution. Eventually, Charles will start making concessions, but the next day or the day after. It's always too little, too late.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Marmont says that he's taking the same measures as he did yesterday, which didn't work then. That's not actually true. Marmont learns from the prior days when his small detachments had failed to do it and says, okay, now I'm going to concentrate my troops.
Right.
Into the famous columns of 3 or arguably 4, it depends on how you classify it, usually classically 3 columns. They can ascend through the city in strength to seize key lines of communication and key points in the city. And had he done this on Tuesday, the first day of the revolution, this might have worked. But by Wednesday, the second day, the barricades are bigger and more numerous, and the French citizens have broken into the gun shops of Paris and stolen muskets. And so now instead of throwing stones at the soldiers, they're firing guns.
There's a bit of irony there, and I'm just realizing it as you're talking. When Napoleon was negotiating peace settlements, he always wanted the peace settlement that was offered last time. A new situation would occur, and he'd be like, okay, I just lost Leipzig. Let's go back to that deal you offered me 6 months ago, whatever it is. But it was always, like you said, too little, too late. And I think Marmont's dealing with the same type of thing.
Yeah, it's the government is always on his back foot in the July Revolution. It's the sort of thing where had they been more proactive, they could have done something. By the time the political concessions are being made, events have moved past them. And the liberal politicians will say, no, we would have taken that deal yesterday, but people have died. We can't. You got to do more. You got to do more. And similarly on the military side, had Marmont done his big attack columns on Tuesday, it might have worked. But on Wednesday, it ends up being a disaster. The soldiers are tired. They have limited ammunition. There are barricades everywhere. Communication is poor. And there are tens of thousands of Parisians with guns in the streets.
Right.
It's hard fighting. The soldiers generally obey their orders, but nobody wants to shoot their own people. It's a civil war going on. The soldiers don't want to shoot the people of Paris, and they're being poorly commanded. They're getting themselves caught and kettled and sniped at from windows.
Yeah,
it's very demoralizing fighting. And Marmont does his best. He sends reinforcements where they're requested. He tries to coordinate. But all 3 columns ultimately end up slinking back home, exhausted and defeated, having failed to achieve any of their objectives.
So eventually he and the king have to flee France and neither return. How does Marshal Marmont live out the rest of his life?
Unfortunately, I think is the way he does that. He's in exile. He can never goes back home to France. Is basically barred from the country. Even if he weren't legally barred, he probably would have been like killed by a mob had he come back as the man who commanded the French army as it shot and killed Parisians. He follows Charles around, the sort of court in exile. Again, Marmont was not a committed ultra-royalist. He was not. In fact, had things been different, had Marmont quit his job when he didn't get the assignment to Algiers and had been unable to do so because he was in debt and needed his salary, he might have been safely in the countryside. Had the riots broken out later, like Marmont thought they were, he thought, oh, there might be riots, but they'll be in September, and I'll be out of the country by then. Had that happened, Marmont might have welcomed the July monarchy, which was a sort of conservative liberal monarchy, very friendly to the bourgeois and to constitutionalism, is the kind of government he would have liked. But because circumstance and his own flaws put him again in this liberal constitutional monarchist, found himself as the paladin of ultra-royalism and had to go down with the ship.
The irony of it, he ends his Napoleonic career saving lives in Paris and preventing the city from getting sacked, and he ends his Bourbon royalist career by killing people in Paris. It's just
and it's reviled for both actions.
Yeah.
Like he's just ultimately he's a real tragic figure in like the classical sense.
Yeah.
In that he is doomed to failure by his own flaws. He is just perpetually almost talented enough for the positions he finds himself in, but not quite talented enough to resolve them. And ultimately he's doomed by his own failures.
Well, I think, other than General Moreau, who I think was the worst decision maker, I think Marmont, maybe he would, you know what? Moreau actually just made two bad decisions. One was an assassination attempt on Napoleon. The other one was returning from America to side with the Allies. He was killed in battle, so that's pretty bad, but it looks like Marmont kept making bad decision after bad decision. He dies in Venice in 1852, the last living of Napoleon's marshals.
He outlived them all.
What do you think his legacy is? Because there's some good in there. I mean, he was good in artillery and the Italian campaigns in the Battle of Marengo. He was a good administrator, but like you said, the term regousser means to betray. He almost strikes me as a French Benedict Arnold. What's his legacy?
I mean, it's certainly not good. He was a talented man, very intelligent. Had things gone differently for him, he could have found himself in positions where he could succeed and excel, but he didn't. He found himself in situations where he was in over his head repeatedly, often through his own mistakes. And when he was in those situations, he repeatedly blundered and failed to extricate himself. What usually happens when you're in over your head.
Yeah.
He made bad decisions. He procrastinated. He was not aggressive in a way that you can easily say, oh, Napoleon would have been in this bad situation, but he would have acted more aggressively to get himself out of it. Had Napoleon been in command in 1830, he would have secured his supply lines. He wouldn't have dithered around for hours and hours waiting for a response from Charles telling him what to do.
Right.
He would have taken the initiative and acted. And you can be sympathetic to Marmont there because he didn't want to do this. And if he was going to have to kill people, he would have preferred to be ordered to have to do it, so he could at least say, I was just following orders. But it doesn't reflect well on Marmont as a commander. I'm more sympathetic than most to Marmont for 1814, for his decision there. Certainly, I think Joseph deserves much more of the blame for the fall of Paris than Marmont does. Napoleon severely overstated the impact of Marmont's surrender, which is certainly not good for Napoleon, but it cost him leverage, not his regime. But, 1830 is just... you could write a textbook about how not to do urban counterinsurgency by looking at what Marmont did in Paris in July 1830. And it's tragic that he was in this situation due to unhappy coincidences and his own mistakes. But ultimately he had this, the exact wrong combination of, military devotion and respect for the chain of command mixed with independent thought in exactly the wrong combinations. He obeyed when he should have questioned, and he questioned when he should have obeyed. just consistently wrong decision making in the pinch.
Yeah. I mean, he probably looked back on his life and I know he visited old battlefields of Napoleonic greatness, and
he wrote his memoirs.
Yep, he wrote his memoirs
to defend himself. He published books of military theory that were well regarded at the time. The intellectual side of warfare was always a strength for him. And as sort of the last living marshal, he had a certain authority in the 1840s, 1850s as someone who could testify to what had happened because everyone else had died. You read in the British press at the time when Marmont's memoirs came out, old officers under Wellington commenting about taking issue with what Marmont had claimed in his memoirs and saying, well, I was there too on the other side, and that's not what happened. This was not a case of someone who had the last laugh because he lived so long and was able to write the definitive account for history. Napoleon had famously said when he went into exile that Marmont will be more miserable than me.
Right.
And Napoleon attacked and slandered Marmont in his conversations and memoirs and stuff like that. And ultimately, people cared a lot more about what Napoleon had to say than what they did about what Marmont did.
Yeah, it's just interesting, and I love all that story you just told us. That's fantastic. Yeah, we'll leave that his legacy to further debate. But yeah, it's not a good one, especially in France. But yeah, David, thank you for that. Again, David's podcast, which I highly recommend, The Siècle.
It's spelled Thesiecle.
That's right.
Thesiècle.com. I've got it's a serialized podcast, so I recommend starting from episode 1. But on the website, I also list a couple other episodes that can be good onboarding points if you want to check out something from a little bit later in the show's run.
Indeed. Well, thank you, my friend. And as always, we appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to seeing the next episode.
Thank you.